I was expecting that. Cheers. Thank you.
Well, great. Thank you so much. And I think we're just about good afternoon at the moment. So thank you all for joining us for this session. It's an interesting topic, very broad. We have about 35, 40 minutes. So we'll be sharp, succinct. And I'm glad to have such an incredible set of lineup of speakers with us today. We'll do a quick round of introductions. We'll be super swift, no pun intended. And let me just kick off the introduction. So I am Kunal Jhanji, a managing director and partner in the London office of BCG, and I head up our payments business in Europe, Middle East, Africa, and South America. I'll pass on to you, Ms. Channa.
So I'm Channa Silva. I'm the CEO of LankaPay, which is equivalent of PCI.
Good morning, all. I'm Sandeep Ubale, Chief General Manager and Deputy Chief Digital Officer of Citibank. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Deven Somaya from Citibank. I'm based in Singapore. I'm globally responsible for what we've defined as emerging commerce solutions. We look at innovation in the transaction banking space with global responsibility. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Paras Kaur from Fonepay Payment Service Limited, Nepal.
Thank you all. So, I mean, as I said, the cross-border market has seen a tremendous amount of innovation. And we within BCG have done a lot of work and assessment on where the market is going. And it is roughly, as we see, it's about $180 trillion transaction volume value market. It's growing at 6 to 7% globally. We still see 70% or more of the transaction volume coming through in a B2X context. So it could be a B2B or a B2C transaction. And 70% of this volume comes from the SMB market. So the mid-market, the small enterprises are a massive user set for cross-border transactions. But we also see a huge amount of fintech activity in this market, given the size and scale and the profitability and the revenue potential of the market. But the challenges in this market remain quite clear. There is lack of transparency. The pricing has become incredibly opaque, and we'll cover and unlock some of these challenges with this group here. But we also want to explore some of the opportunities and the advancements that have happened already in the technology space. The fintechs, for example, have completely transformed UI, UX in the B2B space. We know the Swift GPIs of the world, some of the blockchain and DLT-based initiatives have genuinely made a massive difference in the times around clearing and settlement, the transparency, the pricing, and other innovations that have happened. Regulatory and compliance issues have moved forward. There have been a level of clarity, but I think there is more to go there. So we'll cover a lot of these things, and towards the end, if we get some time, we'll also touch upon any impact the likes of a stablecoin or a CBDC might have in this space. So why don't we start with Mr. Sandeep. In the C2C or a me-to-me end of this market, where do you see some of the challenges operating in the light of what I just painted? Huge market, huge remittance opportunity. Consumers end up using a lot of these functionalities, but the challenges remain.
Thank you, Kunal. So globalization of the businesses and rise in international trade. There is a great surge. Am I audible? No? Yeah. So there is a exponential surge in cross-border transactions. The businesses which hitherto were doing only, were restricting themselves only to the domestic markets are now looking ahead for reaching out to the counterparties which are located thousands of miles away from where the business is actually happening. So now how do we deal with this? Means on one side there is an aspiration to do cross-border transactions because of advanced technology, improved communication methods, and various other things. But then when it comes to transmitting money from point A to point B, and there are several borders in between, international borders, then for small businesses, say there are basically three types: large corporates, medium-sized businesses, and then there are household or individuals who are getting into this cross-border transactions. For large corporates, they have their own way of getting it done. So they know how to navigate through all these complexities and take it to the logical conclusion. But when it comes to small and medium businesses and individuals, though they desire to do all these things, but they get lost into the complexities and the long route of transmitting funds from one point to another point. Now, what happens actually is that there are several intermediaries in between, so it causes delay. Then there is a cost involved because every intermediary will have its own way of fee structure to levy on the transaction which is going through. Then there is no transparency. Means if I have sent money today, my Indian account gets debited today, but my party which is in London or say for matter in New York is still claiming that that party has not received the credit. Then where exactly the funds are lying? And till what time they will be there? That kind of transparency is yet to emerge. And then varied regulations. Every country has its own regulation. Every country has its own real-time payments mechanisms. And now what is happening is, what we are experiencing is that because of seamless RTP that we have today, thanks to UPI, people are now comparing that with cross-border transaction. So the mismatch in expectation is something becoming a challenge. So a layman or a small business, what he wants is that if my account is debited today, my party which is abroad should get money immediately. It doesn't happen that way. There are several things which are there in between. So this is a challenge. How do we address this? How do we come up with something which is central to all countries, and then individual country speaks to this central system, and then that system takes it forward from there, like we do it in domestic scenario. So several deliberations are going on. International Monetary Fund is also leading many initiatives. Singapore has come up with the solution of Nexus. We are also looking at stablecoin as one of the alternates. But these all things are still work in progress. In the intermediary, the person who is doing cross-border transaction, the only option to that customer is to keep in touch with the branch, the bank branch, from where the transaction has been initiated, and they will be able to guide this person. But at the same time, people who wish to do all these things, they need to first educate themselves about the compliances, the risk involved, the international laws for cross-border transactions. They are not, and there should not be comparison with the domestic RTP. Otherwise, it will become very difficult to manage.
Agreed. I think it's a great set of points. Maybe I think, Paras, I should come on to you on the points that Sandeep made around infrastructure, yeah, and the connectivity across different markets and the interoperability across those different infrastructures. What are you doing in Nepal and as part of Fonepay to overcome some of these challenges? Do you see similar challenges in a C2C context? Do you see similar challenges, particularly if we move on to the B2C and P2M payments? These challenges start to become even more nuanced and magnified to some extent.
Thanks, Kunal. Actually, in those sort of dialogues, what we're trying to find out is three basic challenges that these cross-border payments are there. They talk about the cost, transparency of the fees, and the speed of settlement, right? But in our perspective, we look more from customer perspectives, where we see that there are different payment attributes based on the use cases. So we are trying to solve these payment attributes, which is different and not common, based on the use cases. I'll give you an example. When I try to book a hotel in Mumbai, using my mobile app to a UPI QR, my payment attributes is my recourse right, not about speed, or not about the settlement, or not about the cost. Whereas when I get out of the hotel and use metro payments, my payment attribute is how seamlessly I can do the payments. It's not about my recourse right. So I'm the same person using same instrument, but doing two different payments. My payment attribute changes, right? So these are not two common payment attributes are there. So we should solve these payment attributes as alternative payment methods so that we can challenge these incumbent payment networks that are operating. So that's the things we are trying to solve here. And that's how we have successfully done in our case, that we have successfully integrated UPI payment system in Nepal, and Indians can come over in Nepal and seamlessly do the transactions using their UPI apps in Fonepay's QR. So that's the, I mean, they can do the QR payments like locals. So that's the, challenges that we have solved. Instead of, discussing more about what is the cost, what is the transparency of fees, what are the legal contracts, and all the settlement risk and all that, that is there. But we are more focusing on consumer side so that they can, don't feel the difference when they are making the payments. At the same time, we also address these payment attributes which are different when they do have a different use cases, as I have said in my example. So that's how we are solving it and putting the customer in front of it rather than all the back-end stages things that we do.
Are you facing any legal or compliance mismatch as you look at the interoperability across?
Yeah,
different-
when you come over the cross-border integration, it is always there because there are different jurisdictions, different rules applies, and networks have its own specific rules also. So yes, it is also always there, and we alternative payment method systems that we are operates is always there because from domestic we are moving into the cross-border system. So it is always there, but we have tried to find out somewhere in the middle that we can agree in the dispute settlement mechanism as well as the legal barriers also. So we have come over it. And since if we focus the consumer at the front, these all things will be it's not a matter of concern for us.
Yeah, I think if I move on to LankaPay, because I know Fonepay has been integrating with MPCI, UPI, and with LankaPay, what are you seeing in your market? Now, clearly, Sri Lanka is incredibly dependent on remittances. There is a huge tourism sector. Cross-border transactions, FX transactions are incredibly important to the domestic economy as well as enabling some of the trade corridors in the Southern Asian markets. So how are you seeing that sort of play out in your region?
Yeah, so thank you for that question. I think I'll take from where Paras stopped. I think the main issue that we saw, I'm going to be a bit controversial here, right? In terms of interoperability, integration, I think that's been a topic for decades. And is that coming with a common standard, right? I mean, everybody's trying to put a common standard. I know the larger privately owned networks were able to force common standard across worldwide. But now the problem is we are dealing with sovereign nations and country-specific networks, domestic networks, who are governed by regulations in those countries and geopolitics. So one country may not agree with the standard of another country, right, to adopt a common standard. So I know that BIS is through the Project Nexus coming up with a common standard, but hitting so many roadblocks because two countries may not agree with each other. So these are, but the problem is that I think as Paras said, how do we solve consumer and business problems, leaving the complexities behind, right? And because that's the number one fundamental thing we need. So in that sense, how do we connect? I think that is the biggest challenge that we need to solve. So are we going with a common standard, or are we sticking to the same standard and trying to be interoperable? I think that the latter is the most possible. I mean, I think coming up with a common standard in the long term might be a better option, but I don't think it's possible because are we going to change the banks, the fintechs, the NBFIs, all those guys, are they going to change their standards? Are they going to change their systems? It's not going to happen in the short term, or maybe in the long term. So in that sense, how do we be interoperable and ensure that the businesses and the consumers can function? So in that sense, what we have actually looked at is let the systems be as it is. For example, somebody in India going to Sri Lanka or Nepal, can they use the same application to do a transaction in the other country without changing anything? The same experience. So that is where the interoperability comes through format conversion. Some countries follow ISO 8583, some countries 20022, some countries API, and are we going to change those standards into one? It's month of Sundays. So what we've seen working, put something in the middle, where it does a format conversion, EMV to non-EMV, ISO 8583 to a different standard. That works. And no change on either side. And the transaction goes through, the settlement goes through an acceptable mechanism.
Yeah. Do you see the role of, and we're in the Fintech Fest, I'd love to sort of explore, do you see market middlewares and fintechs operating on a layer above enable some form of uniformity in these standards? Because I think that's the problem that fintechs are solving, frankly, in many parts of the payments ecosystem. They are enabling a one-to-many solution. They are enabling some form of complexity management underlying all of these different infrastructures. Are you seeing any of that activity, and is that activity helpful?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a level playing field for fintechs to get in, and most of the fintechs are in there. So I think the problems that they need to solve are, one is on the consumer side, the business side, how do they actually carry out the transaction? And also, how do you solve the complexities in connecting national networks together without actually asking them to change systems? So we are seeing a lot more fintechs getting into that, I would say, middleware, the interoperability space. And there's a lot of opportunities because that is where the play is right now. And once you do that, actually, once you connect all this, then we can probably look at phase 2, phase 3 coming into common standards. But first, the opportunity is in your face, be interoperable without actually changing national standards domestically that is set up. I think that is the way forward, at least in the short term. In medium to long term, maybe we can look at coming up with common standards and trying to get there.
That's great. Mr. Ubale, I'd love to get your thoughts on, you've been driving a lot of the digital agenda within the largest bank in India.
Yeah.
The fintechs have genuinely transformed the UI, UX, journey, expectation of a customer. How are the banks going to compete in this very complex environment, in the cross-border market, in lack of uniformity in standards, and particularly, I think you and I were talking backstage around the challenges faced by the small and medium enterprises in the cross-border market. How do you see the larger banks trying to solve for that and rising up to the challenge that the fintechs are presenting to some extent?
As far as cross-border transactions are concerned, there is not much competition. See, there are basically 3 tracks, if you look at it. Cryptocurrency, which is the most convenient and stable to some extent. Then the CBDC, which is being promoted by various central banks. And the third is the traditional and conventional. But you will find most of the traffic, more than 95%, is on traditional and conventional channels for cross-border transaction. The reason being, they are the most compliant and they are the most safest way of doing it. Having said that, when we are talking about the fintech roles, in this entire ecosystem of cross-border transactions, we have not seen many fintechs coming forward with some workable solutions. It's still work in progress, as I said in my opening remarks. Fintechs, yes, they have their own advantages, lightweight, fast decisions, driven by mostly younger promoters. And they are more outward looking when it comes to UI and UX and the customer experience. Whereas big banks or traditional banks, when they look at UI and UX, they always have at the back of their mind the traditional way of doing banking, the regulations, because banks are highly regulated entities, the regulations that they have to adhere to, the data which traditional banks hold. How do I protect my data? While I'm very keen on doing a better UI and UX, can I trade off with some of the securities attached to my regulations and my conditions attached to my regulations and security attached to my data? So it's a very, it's kind of a
Tough balance.
It's a very tough job. Okay, but in cross-border transactions, fintechs are welcome to come ahead with solutions. Now, how do I match it with my conventional way of doing cross-border transactions, which is the most acceptable mode as on date, despite a lot of inconveniences attached to it, because people feel more comfortable doing it in that way. How do I match the innovation that will come from these fintechs with my traditional system? Will be an interesting way forward.
Yeah.
What our friend from Nepal was citing, the UPI experiment of if, a tourist going to Nepal and doing a P2M transaction just by scanning a QR code of a merchant in Nepal or some tourist facility in Nepal without getting into any conversion of currencies and all those things. His account in India gets debited and the merchant in Nepal gets paid instantly. But for all these solutions, there is a limitation. The cap is there on the amount and how many transactions you can do per day. It's a good beginning, and NIPL, NPCI International Private Limited, is doing a great job in this area. We are already live with Singapore, P2P, P2M. We are live with Nepal for P2M. And Sri Lanka also, it's work in progress, but very soon I think we'll be able to.
It's already live.
It's already live now, okay. So in Sri Lanka also it's already live. So the trend that I am seeing is that first we are trying it out with the immediate neighbors. So original camaraderie is there.
Yeah.
Coordination is much better. We can we travel to Singapore and Mauritius for this kind of to enable this kind of cross-border payment for the tourists who are visiting these places, and they are working quite well, and people are also happy. But this is only the beginning. When it comes to C2C or P2C, and for goods and services payments and all that, then the complexities and the challenges are slightly different. And
Let me move on to you, Deven. I think
we need to find a solution for that.
That's really helpful. I'd love to get your thoughts on some of these complexities, but if you go on to B2B, I'd love for you to comment on B2B as well, because the complexities there sort of increased multiple times overall, right? And given the footprint of the bank you're at in the number of markets you serve your clients, what are you seeing some of these trends in the B2B or in the B2C segment?
Kunal, so thank you for that. I think it's a great topic of discussion, and I'll maybe pick up on your previous question and carry it forward. If you think about globally and many players that are in this space, there is a big shift in thought process. I think banks have traditionally held the view of the whole concept of controlling your own destiny, which was technology, in-house build, etc. That was the traditional way of doing it. And I think, by the way, this event and many like this are a great testament to it, that now the mindset is shifting. So to your question on the user experience part of it, you're seeing a lot of thought process saying, you know what, core product processor, in-house, but there's a lot of UI, UX conversations which are, you know what, someone else is doing it better. We can more seamlessly integrate. And by the way, your point is very valid. We're highly regulated entities, so it's very important that that bridge is connected and connected very well. Otherwise, it's not happening. But we're seeing a lot of that play out now. As I kind of come into the B2B space, but I'll bring one more data point in as well, right? It's very interesting as I look at myself. Let's talk consumer payments for a second. I hold one card in my wallet. I'm a very old school guy. That's what I use predominantly. But as I talk to my team members who are coming out of college, joining the banks, understanding how they pay, it's extremely different, right? There are a lot of global companies that have come into the space and disrupted how, when you travel, how you travel, what you're paying with, and how those cross-border payment transactions are happening. One is exactly what we're talking about here, right? Which is the likes of Nexus, et cetera, have all been set up to alleviate those challenges. But there's a lot of players that are coming in to simplify that space as well. But let's move into B2B, because that's kind of, if you think about it, B2B always happened. I mean, we move trillions of dollars a day. I mean, that's effectively what we're supporting. We're supporting large global trade is large banks. That's what we support. The challenge was not on the fact that the payment couldn't happen. The payment happens. But I think, to the points that were made earlier, there were, three on speed, on cost, and transparency were the main challenges. Interoperability is becoming a big issue over and above that now. And I think the fifth dimension, which is also coming in, is as you look at these factors coming into play, there are a lot of value-added services that also now need to come on. Like if I'm making a payment, let's say, Kunal, to your organization in London from Singapore, and it's a B2B payment. I'm not moving $10 where the risk is low. I may be moving millions of dollars. If I don't know your account is a valid account and it belongs to the organization you represent, I'm carrying a massive risk, right? So there's a validation services. The second could be around data as well. If my organization is paying your organization, and you just receive a blank payment with alphanumeric digits around it, someone sitting in the back end is trying to figure out what is this, right? So there's a lot of room for enhancement that comes in. It may not necessarily come from the banks, right? And that's why the ecosystem at large is great in solving some of these challenges. And I think that intersection becomes crucially important. And I'll make one last comment, right? Which is, I think, someone in a reg body made this comment, right? I mean, look, cross-border payments are important, speed is important, but the governance around it is exceptionally critical. They talk about, cars going fast. It's not the engine that determines how fast a car goes. It's how good the brakes are that will determine how fast that car goes. So all the controls that we build around it are very important, right? As you look at Nexus and any other project, it's not the connect. Payments can move, but are we sending the right data to make sure that a transaction that, if Nepal has a sanction screening requirement on a certain field, is that being carried through or not? That becomes very critical.
Listen, I think I would concur with most of the points you said, but I do want to sort of challenge a bit this group. For a long time, the banks and some of the larger institutions have fallen behind. The regulations are tough, the compliance is tough, but the fintechs have innovated. Yeah, there has been a significant movement. There has been a massive amount of push that the fintechs have given the larger organizations. If you look at the innovations, even in a B2B context, the result that is with GPI today is not because suddenly they wanted to innovate, because they were seeing pressure, right? So there is an avenue for improvement. So are you guys resting behind regulations and compliance way too much?
Not at all, Kunal. And in fact, it's exactly the point you're making, which is, I don't think, so let's break it down, right? Let's look at banks and the fintech community. I think 10 years back, the conversation was very different. 5 years back, the conversation was different. And it, I think, changed over who felt who, could be partnered with or not. But I think if you look at the world today, I think the banks and fintechs, I think there's a intersection of 3 areas. One, there could be a client. Second, yes, there is competition. And third, I think the large intersection is the partnership. How do we work together in this ecosystem to solve for? By the way, a lot of the players that people use, including myself on a personal front, to move monies, underlying is a bank account, right? That fundamental doesn't change, but you're spot on. We get better by pushing each other, right? There's no way we can stay behind the fact that, hey, it's regulated, ergo we won't touch it. I think we're getting better than, that's what I'm saying. Product processor, we may still want to hold and control, because ultimately a central bank is going to look at us from a liability and responsibility perspective and the fiduciary responsibility. But the UI, UX, and a lot of other things we can be pushed on and work together on and get to a much better state.
Let me move on the group to another topic. Just staying with you, Deven, for a moment. So I think if you look at not just the UI, UX, the experiences, the push that the fintechs have given, I think pricing, both in B2B and in B2C, has been incredibly and radically shifted over the last few years, right? If I take European examples and the US examples, which are the markets I serve, the likes of TransferWise, which I think are present in these markets, I've seen a few guys present in this room, Currency Clouds of the world, we've got other entities in the B2B market which have genuinely shifted pricing and brought pricing to the attention of the consumers, right? And today, a lot of gaming is happening around pricing, and the consumers have become very educated around. I think, Mr. Ubale, you mentioned the pricing challenges. People don't want to be, given a
It should
number.
not come as a surprise.
It shouldn't
That's what
come as
my
a
point
surprise,
is.
absolutely. So where do you see pricing ultimately landing, and what changes have you seen over the years?
Look, it's a great question. I think we can probably talk about this for a very long time and agree and disagree on a lot of stuff as well. Sustainability is very important. Look, for innovation to happen and value to be perceived, for someone to say that, look, there's value in this, someone's got to pay for something. Now, in the short term, I think, I think we've always got to keep short term aside, because it can be done through subsidization through multiple channels to get to a good state. But sustainability will come from pricing for value. And I don't mean overcharging, that's not the point. But the point is if there is value in my organization paying your organization in real time, you getting the liquidity today, 24/7, etc., there is an underlying big cost to it. And that cost has to also be understood. So the transparency has to be on both sides.
Exactly.
And when you value, that's when you drive towards value and then you price to value. I think it's important. Look, I think we came from different times when there was just inherent cost put on certain things. I think those days are gone or going.
It's a great point. Mr. Sandeep, I'd love to come on to you. What do you see the pricing trend in the C2C or a B2C context?
Yeah, I will start with the domestic scenario.
Please, yeah.
Please allow me that. What we have seen in last 10 years is that the customers in India, Indian markets, the shift is more towards UI UX, the experience and the comfort. And the pricing has taken a backseat. And I'm talking purely from the domestic scenario point of view. And that is because somewhat there is an increase in earnings also. The spending, ability to spend has gone up. And the tendency to, and as he mentioned, the next gen is the main customer today. And there the bent of mind is that I am more interested in comfort rather than pricing. Of course, the safety is something which nobody compromises on. But when it comes to cross-border transaction, when we talk about pricing in context of cross-border transaction, two parties perhaps are not knowing each other. And the trust is built only on the basis of some kind of documents that they were exchanged or some agreement that they were entered into. Okay. So, if I have remitted $10,000 to you, you also trust me that I will be sending you a full amount. And I also have intention, noble intention of you receiving the entire $10,000. But when you end up receiving $9,700, then I am not aware where the $300 have gone, and you also don't know whether I have sent short amount or the $300 got lost in between the fees of some intermediaries and the other banks. So it's not a question of $300 or $100. It's a question of I am not aware of what is happening, you are not aware of what is happening. How do we address this? So pricing, yes, it matters. No one will say that pricing doesn't matter. It does matter. But what matters more is the visibility of this pricing or the fee structure. So that I have a complete visibility of what amount I need to send you to also top it up with, the fees that will be there in between.
No, great.
So,
I think so. What you're referring to is the transparency in the value chain, where the monies are being sent and how the fee are being structured. And secondly, I think the speed of clearing and settlement, that's also become pretty important.
Yes.
So that sort of overall openness around how things are, where things are, when they will be remitted or sent.
So that I am able to
Yes.
take a more well-informed decision. And I also tell you, say I am sending you X amount. It is possible you may receive X minus 1 or X minus 2. So that you don't suddenly start doubting my credibility and vice versa. Means I don't have doubts on your way of doing the business.
Agreed. I think it's a great point. Let me just move on to the infrastructure. What pricing structures are you setting? What feedback are you getting from the market when you look at P2M or a P2P transaction?
Yeah, I think pricing is a very subjective area, right? It's again based on the value that you provide, right? Is somebody willing to pay a price based on the value they receive? So we have a rule of thumb. If a transaction costs below the minimum public transport cost, company would be able to pay. Because nothing comes free, right? I mean, there has to be infrastructure that need to be, somebody has to invest. You need to be. So I was in a conference in Thailand where they were presenting the fintechs are bleeding because central bank has gone and said MDR is going to be 0. So how do you sustain 0 and invest and make it sustainable in the long term? So I always believe as long as you have addressed the right use case, whether it's B2B or B2C, or whatever the transaction, the consumers are willing to pay a price provided we address their need. So for example, in terms of the transparency, we are seeing a lot of fintechs showing exactly how much the receiver is going to get on the apps. They actually show it right to the consumer before they transfer. So they know, right? So that there is a mechanism through technology to figure out how much is going to go, right? And also now we are seeing a lot of fintechs building systems to track that payment. Where is it stuck? How many days? So, I mean, these are opportunities in terms of, so pricing, I think, is very, very subjective because in Thailand, when they did zero, the fintechs came and showed how much they are bleeding. All their P&L is completely red, and they're not going to sustain in the long term. So for fintechs and technology companies to sustain, one is there has to be some decent pricing where it's long-term sustainable, and I think Deven touched on partnerships. Because doing it alone is not going to be sustainable because you can't make a lot of money out of transactions. So it's the other value-added services that you provide and how much you charge, and that can be done in terms of banking. What we have seen is fintechs going and create a float for the bank, and then it's a mutual partnership because banks make money out of float, right? Yeah. So that's a nice marriage where both benefit, right, from a transaction. So I think pricing is subjective. As long as you address the right use case, the consumers, whether it's B2B or B2C, they are willing to pay a price, and the right price, obviously, it can't be high. But I think the discussion should be, are we addressing the world problems?
I think it's a great set of perspectives. Paras, what do you think on the infrastructure side, what you're seeing in Nepal?
I see a little bit differently. I mean, fintechs has intervened only the front-end part. The back-end part, where the actual fund moves, is still dominated by 7 or 10 international banks, right? So that's where the problem is. And I think the solution is only the tokenization of FX reserve in the form of wholesale CBDC, which will provide the level playing field for all the national banks, irrespective of sizes or international networks. Then it will expect it to bring down the cost, speed, and improve the tracking mechanism that we have, the problem right now we have in the legacy correspondent banking frameworks. So that's the problem is. For the front-end part, I think we have solved all the things. As Channa sir has rightly said, we have the visibility of, consumer can have the visibility of what sort of FX margin there, what is the charges there, but the problem is the back-end, the actual formula side, which is dominated by the correspondent banking framework, the legacy framework, and there's the problem. I think at central banks of different parts of the world are taking measures like wholesale CBDCs and MBREs-like solution. I think that is the game changer in the coming couple of years.
Right on cue there. So Deven, maybe, it's a contentious statement. The correspondent banks, banking infrastructure and ecosystem is to be blamed. What do you think CBDCs, or frankly, some of the larger banks have introduced their own stable coins? Where do you see that having any impact or threat the way the cross-border market works?
So, Kunal, maybe we broaden the conversation out, right, in terms of not just on CBDC, but let's bring emerging technologies also into fore, if that's okay, because I think just because things have happened a certain way, I don't think they necessarily need to continue down that path. But in order for us to get to a great end state, right, I think there is a level of experimentation that will need to go on, and that may need to happen using, emerging tech that's coming around. Blockchain is a great example. Because the one thing we've probably not talked about on the B2B side, for example, and let me just add that in as we look at this mix is, we talked about, the cost to banks, to fintechs, to regulators, etc., sovereign costs as well. We've not talked about the customer, right? In order to embark on B2B and you've changed the level playing field with new tech coming in, how ready are customers to make that change and invest as well in tech? Because adoption is important. So, you can create whatever rails we want, but if there's no adoption, what are we going to do? If you make adoption hard, right, and pass on all the work or the cost, either one, right, is a combination of two, there's going to be no adoption. And hence that experimentation is important. So there's a lot of work going on with either semi-closed loop, blockchain networks, emergence of CBDCs, so there are projects that connect a few central banks to move monies as well. It's great because that will lead to outcomes. There are pre-MVPs, MVPs that are going on that will lead to outcomes. And then there's I think BIS is driving a project Agora as well, which is bringing 7 central banks of the world to move dollars around. I think all of this will get us to a great end state. But I think, as Mr. De Silva also put it, there's work to do. In the short term, we're not going to get there.
Agreed.
These are all long-term outcomes, but we have to experiment to figure out and fine-tune over time what that great end state is. Because look, ultimately, like I said, especially in B2B, it's the customer and their adoption. If they're not, like if you're going to make them create a separate ledger on a tokenized currency, listen, no company wants to maintain two ledgers, right? So if fiat is still primary, maybe banks can do the tokenization and the heavy lifting on that front. So look, there are multiple ways to do it, but I think that those are some of the points that at least I thought were relevant.
I think that's great. And we're pretty much on time. So I think I'll probably open the questions, if there are any, in the room. And we can perhaps take a couple of questions. Okay, just one question.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for this great insightful session to the panel. Amazing insights. Myself, Abhishek Saraf. I'm a public and private investor and a budding angel investor as well. So I wanted to touch upon one challenge probably which we didn't touch is on money laundering. So how has the challenge, how are we navigating the challenge of money laundering in the new advanced digital age and the new tech? And has tech actually helped to reveal bad actors more or conceal bad actors more? Just your open view on how you are seeing this and how are we going to tackle this going forward?
Maybe I can start, and because this is probably a question for all of us, I would imagine. Look, it's a great question, and I think tech gets better, money launderers get, so it's never going to be an end state. This is going to be a continuous improvement phase. But see, just take a simple example of how money moved in the past. It was typically person or company A to person or company B. You now have a world where there are a lot of intermediaries that are involved, payment intermediaries that are involved. So the emergence of, let's just call it payment schema, right? To capture all of that information becomes ultimately important, right? And that's why, the point on whether it's ISO 20022 or whatever it is, the tech layer becomes very important in ensuring everything that is needed is captured. Cross-border adds a level of complexity because a lot of times the end recipient may not even know a transaction was initiated cross-border because you may be connecting domestic to cross-border to domestic rails as well. So that transparency in that payment information becomes excessively important to make sure that local regs at all points are capturing and screening everything that needs to be screened to ensure that things are compliant. And then look, the transparency that comes with blockchain, etc., just maybe makes life a little bit simpler on that front. So maybe that's a quick synopsis.
Yeah, I think one of the it's gone. Yeah. So one of the things that actually what we are seeing is there are a lot of opportunities for fintechs and other tech providers like WorldCheck and others. There are services that they provide. So before a transaction is actually initiated, you can actually do a lot of checking before the transaction goes through. So which the technology is right now available. So as long as you adopt them, whether it's at the bank level or at a global level, the technology is there. So it's just a matter of using the right technology to make sure you minimize. You can't 100% say, any technology is not 100%, but at least to a greater extent, you can say 99.whatever% that it's true by checking maybe one or two, checks in terms of validity, sanitary checks, the terrorism fund financing to AML, right? So actually the solutions are available. So I think you can do that before actually transaction is initiated to minimize this threat.
Super. All right, well, listen, thank you so much, everyone, and thank you for all the speakers. Thank you.
Good picture. Thanks for a good picture.